We're going to start. Before we start this actual program, today happens to be the 13th day of Tera Din, of the passing away of Bihari Krishna Shrestha. He's a major, eminent social scientist in Nepal, the first ethnographer, friend to many of us, and a benefactor of the social science Baha. So I request that in his memory, we just observe 1 minute silence. Please. Start. Thank you. Today we have with us David Seddon. He's here just visiting Nepal after, 30, 40 years. And Nirmal and I managed to Shanghai him into coming and sharing his observations. Let me just recall, when I first started my career way back in 1979-80, I just come back from my studies and joined the government of Nepal. The books that came out then, including Nepal in Crises, really caused upheaval. It was one of the most memorable, intellectual upheaval at the time when the referendum had been announced, whether people want the panchayat system or the restorative or a multi-party system. It was quite an upheaval. It was one of the first times that such a neo-Marxist theoretical approach was taken to Nepal's development, and actually in some circles it caused quite a crisis. He'll tell you more about other crises that it caused, but what was important was, I think it set into motion something that's lacking now, and that's why I sort of insisted, Nirmal and I, that we just informally, at least, even if nothing else, discuss that. What is important is, after that, 10 years after that, the Berlin Wall fell, Soviet Union collapsed, and so on. And a unipolar world came into being. The idea was, okay, now, governments are irrelevant, markets will do the development. If anything social has to be done, it will be done by NGOs. Okay, that period lasted for a while. And now we have what I call the age of Trump, or in Nepali I call it Trump Tandav. Tandav, the Sanskrit word, Shiva's dance of destruction at the end of the cycle. So we have Trump Tandav going on, which is also calling into question now, that sort of neoliberal idea that development is something that only markets can do, and and through NGOs or something like that. Now we are therefore living in very interesting times. There are no ready-made easy answers, but I asked Ganesha to show. He said he would come here. Sometime back at the Soviet Alumni Association we have here. I'm also a Berkeley Alumni Association, you see, trained by both the KGB and the CIA, I guess. We had a meeting where I argued that with the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union, not Marxism, and given the sad state of Marxism in Nepal right now, the less said the better, but Marxian thinking has become even more imperative. I mean, you don't have to agree with just about everything Marx said, but the idea that you have what a rampant capitalism or rampant uncontrolled market does in terms of social justice and everything else is even more stark today. And I'm afraid if you have the most powerful country in the world saying that Gaza can be converted into a Riviera, New York waterfront development, we have some serious thinking to do, especially in the global south. Which is why I thought that, taking this fortunate chance of David happening to come around, that we just talk about what has happened in these last 50 years and what might be there up ahead. So I'm particularly interested in the younger scholars here in the audience because there's a lot of theoretical thinking that needs to be done. And as boldly as, almost 50 years ago that you guys began that Nepalan crisis sort of study. There's a need to rethink development, there's a need to rethink democracy, there's a need to rethink all kinds of things right now. Okay? So this is why we are here. So without much ado, I'm going to ask David to give his talk. The format will be he'll speak for about 30-40 minutes and then we go for discussion, question, answers. I'll be moderating that. I'll take 3 questions from the audience first, get him to answer, then go for a second round or 3 more questions and so on till the sun burns out. Thank you. So David, the floor is all yours.
Well, thank you very much, Deepak. First, I should apologize for speaking in English. It's a long time since my Nepali was sufficiently good to do us talk in Nepali, but that is an apology. But the second thing is a thank you. It's a thank you to the Social Science Paha for inviting me here to talk to you this afternoon. I apologize for my throat. I seem to have developed what they call in English a frog in your throat. But I hope that I'll be able to illustrate some of the kind of highlights of the last 50 years, because Deepak has explained when he came back. I first came to Nepal in 1974. It's 50 years. So it's not just 50 years of Nepal, it's 50 years of me having visited and being in Nepal on and off. And it's a long story. So I won't bore you with 50 minutes of 1 minute every year, but try and highlight some theoretical issues, some practical issues, and some political issues. I really have a very few notes because I did not know what I would say before I came, but I would like to respond to the flavour of the introduction. We do live in interesting times, and this is in fact well known as a Chinese curse. Now, we're not just living in the era of Trump, that's recent, that's the last month. And by goodness, it's been sufficiently exciting. This is also a year of China rising for the next 50 years, in my prediction. This is going to change the world. And Nepal has always been somehow caught, as a well-known phrase, Prithvi Narayan Shah said, a yam between 2 boulders. Well, one of those boulders has just got bolder, and that's China. But for Nepal, negotiating between those two, between India and China, is going to be an extraordinarily important part of Nepal's future. And how well the politicians and the government manage that, and how well ordinary people in Nepal manage that, is going to be one of the important features. So that draws attention to the fact that everything that's happened in Nepal over the last 50 years has to be understood to some extent in a global context. There has always been an outside world, what happens in Nepal, and even before 1951, Nepal has never been isolated. A lot of people talk about the Ranas and how closed it was. Nepal has never been closed. It was more restricted, but a long history of Nepal suggests that north-south trade between Tibet, China, and India has always been important, and capturing the Kathmandu Valley was so important for Prithvi Narayan Shah, not just because it was the center of civilization within this part of the world in a way, but also because it captured trade routes north and south and new resources. So in a way, Nepal has always been, I think, part of a wider global system. Now, when I first came here in 1974, I came with 4 other young men, we were 30 in our 30s. 4 of us had never been to Nepal before. It was completely new territory. I'd spent 2 or 3 years working in Morocco on a PhD. I thought I was going to be a North Africa, Middle East specialist. Well, I've done some of that, but I got hauled into a project with 3 other British guys and a Frenchman. The Frenchman was the only person who'd been here before, Alain Fournier, who'd been an anthropologist and done some work here. But the rest of us were complete novices. My colleague Piers Blakey, who was a geographer, had worked in Bihar on family planning and population. John Cameron was an economist and hadn't really worked very much abroad at all. David Feldman was an agriculturalist and was interested in agricultural economics. And so this little group, as it were, suddenly were confronted with a country they knew nothing about. So we had the temerity to try and say how we found it. We had no preconceptions, we were not politically involved in any way in Nepal, we had no preconceptions about what we would find. And the reason we were here is because the Ministry of Overseas Development in Britain is building part of the East-West Highway. And they thought it would be a nice idea if they could do an evaluation of the effects of this road. And we say, well, you can't really look at the effects of a road that's still under construction, you know, it doesn't make sense. So we said, well, we'll try and look at 3 roads within the western central region, which is now Gandaki and Lumbini. Those were the 2 zones at the time. And we will look at the Siddhartha Rajmarga, which goes from Pokhara down to India, and was the oldest road built by the Indians as part of their entry into Nepal, much as they have an entry into Sikkim and Bhutan and so on. And that was one of the first major roads in Nepal. The second was the Prithvi Rajmarga, which connected Kathmandu with Pokhara, which had only just opened in 1973 when we arrived, and this road under construction in the East-West Highway. So we arrived, we drove down. 2 of my colleagues had driven overland in a Land Rover from Britain to Nepal, quite an undertaking, following the Kathmandu hippie road. But 1974, when we arrived, I'm suddenly live, it seems. 1974, when we arrived, was interesting because it's the end of the hippie era. As various people have pointed out, that was really dying down. King Birendra had outlawed hash and criminalised, you know, those sorts of things. So we were at the end of an era. But it was a period when King Birendra was on the throne. It was a period when the Ministry of Overseas Development, under Harold Wilson, a Labour government, had just created a new ministry. And so we were part of a new thrust of development at workers. God help us, Nepal has suffered enough and experienced enough of development aid over the years, but we were here in Nepal to carry out a big project to look at the effects of roads in that region. And we had a lot of money. We had a lot of money for 4 young men. We had hundreds of thousands of pounds to spend. It's not possible now. And so we mounted this enormous research project, I think unique in Nepal, of a team. We recruited young people. And the prerequisites for the team were that they would be able to speak a little bit of English, because we were just beginning to speak and learn Nepali. But they would be, most importantly, prepared to go anywhere, to talk to anybody with respect, Dalit, Brahmin, whatever. And we tried to recruit a number of Dalit young men, as well as others, and women. We were kind of avant-garde in our ideas. It proved impossible. The Dalit young men could not work with the others. There were all sorts of problems. And we could only find one woman who was prepared to join us as a research student. And I have to pay tribute to Karma Gurung, who was the only daughter of Captain Gurung, who'd been in the Gurkhas, and brought his girl up to be independent and feisty. And Karma Gurung joined our team. So we recruited this large number of people to look at what was happening in the area, near the roads, quite far from the roads, and a very long way from the roads. And that was our conceptual framework. We wanted to look at what was happening nearby with the roads, what was happening near the roads, and what was happening far from the roads. And to cut a long story short, we found that most people, of course, in the region were small farmers, were agriculturalists. And we tried to make sense of the structures of production of agriculture, because that was what most people really relied on. And very briefly, we might want to talk about this theoretically, and I won't dwell on it. We thought that there we could see the vast majority of people, men, women, children, so were in what we could call peasant families, small producers on small bits of land, mainly producing for themselves, mainly selling a little every now and again, but essentially a peasant, what we call a mode of production, a way of organising production and living. And then there was Obviously, particularly in the Terai, but not only in the Terai, there were landowners, large landlords, who had tenants and bonded labourers and serfs, and that sort of structure, which we called rather poorly semi-feudal. We're not quite sure how to characterise it, but it was rather like the feudal period in some ways in Britain in the sort of 13th, 14th, 15th centuries, with landowners and peasants. But the peasants were tied to the landowners. We call it a semi-feudal mode of production. And then there was a very small number already of farmers who were trying to produce for a market. And this was the sort of classic capitalist farmers. They invested money, they produced goods, which they sold on the market, and they employed wage labour, usually day labour. So we identified these as structures of production. And we can come back to this, because I don't want to spend too long on this, but the immediate impact of the roads that we looked at, and again this is very summary because it was fairly recent that the Prithviraj Marg had opened, we thought there were some things that were happening that were positive. There was a relocation from remote and nearer areas down to the roadside. So along the roads there was growth of centres, new centres grew up, new settlements, new small towns. That was very dramatic. So it had sort of urban growth taking place. And Pokhara was the centre place, we lived in Pokhara, and it was growing very fast, partly because it was an administrative centre and was growing with bureaucracy and so on and so forth, but also because people were migrating to the town. So that was the beginning of one thing, urban growth, migration down to the roadsides. Now that usually involved people who were reasonably able to move and who were better off. So on the whole, the better off moved and they benefited from being on the roads. And those who were left behind perhaps were not disadvantaged but didn't gain those benefits. So some people gained a lot more benefit than others. Porters along the routes were dislocated, lost their jobs, had to relocate, but there were new possibilities along the roads themselves. A new transport sector developed, lots of people driving new vehicles and buses, people were able to move from place to place. So transport, mobility, all these sorts of things increased enormously. Okay, so I'll leave that period of the 70s. What we found was basically what I would call an agrarian economy. That's what we were looking at. But we're also looking at the beginnings of concentration along roads, improvement and development of transport, increasing social mobility, and increasing flows of goods. But the flows of goods were largely from south to north. They were up from India. There was very little response in terms of production locally. So farmers were not producing for these new markets that were growing. Very little response, very little development of capitalist agriculture. So the agriculture sector didn't seem to be particularly interested. But a lot of traders, a lot of merchants, a lot of transport, bus owners, truck owners, and the beginnings of towns. So what we saw was a process of sort of development, but very unequal. It affected different people in different ways. But on the whole, it promoted a sort of growing inequality between those who are living in the hinterlands and those who are living along the roads in the urban areas. But that was the agricultural economy. We came back 20 years later to do a restudy. Again, I think this is unusual in Nepal, very few restudies 20 years later. And we did some of the same samples in the same areas. We actually met people 20 years later. And we found that plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The more it changes, the more it's sort of the same thing. The vast majority of people that we interviewed in the rural areas, near and far from the roads, were still very small farmers, selling a little bit of produce, not a great deal. So not much capitalist development in farming. Large numbers of people were beginning to go from the hills to work in India, abroad. So there was migration out and more migration to the towns. We found that, to our surprise, there were still remnants of landlords and bonded labourers and so on. That semi-feudal sort of structure still was there 20 years later. And so it seemed that the agrarian economy was really not particularly dynamic in terms of producing the sort of change that we thought there would be. Now, this is 1995, 96, 20 years later. The World Bank had just supported a living standard survey. And that survey was very interesting. Not many people had kind of got into the nitty-gritty of it, but we looked at it. And we found that a surprisingly large number of people in the rural areas, even in the remoter areas, were getting money from abroad, from India and from elsewhere. Remittances were quite a substantial part of the agrarian economy. It seemed to us rather new and rather dramatic. And so we puzzled over this, because 1996 was when John Mellor drafted the Agricultural Perspective Plan. It was a key document, and we went to talk to him and other people. So this was the idea that Nepal's development would be centrally based on agricultural development, Agricultural Perspective Plan, the agrarian economy. We haven't found very much dynamism, but Mellor and the Agricultural Perspective Plan was saying, yeah, but this will come. If we do this with roads and certain inputs and so on, agricultural development will take place. So that was sort of interesting, but contradicted what we found. But hey, what do we know? We didn't know much about Nepal anyway. So we went to see people who really did know. The World Bank, the World Bank top, very influential. And the World Bank were still saying agriculture is the motor of development in Nepal. It's mid-1990s, sorry. So there's a puzzle there. So out of the second round of this team research, we were sort of contradicting what most people were saying. Agriculture didn't seem to be particularly dynamic. We thought we saw something new in livelihoods, and that was remittances coming in. And not just from Gurkhas and army employment, which has always been part of the hill economy and society, but people who are actually being employed abroad. So we got a little tiny bit of money from DFID, which was the Department for International Development, which it was now called, to do some further work on rural livelihoods and to look at this business of migration and remittances. And out of that work, I then began to work with Ganesh Gurung and Jagannath Adhikari, two Nepali colleagues. And we were looking at what these remittances, where they were coming from, where they were going to, what the flow was, and so on. And we were quite struck that the scale of this seemed to us really substantial. We're talking about the mid-90s. And no one was talking about it. So we talked to economists, academics in Nepal, and they hadn't really noticed, or they talked about it, but everybody knew that people went abroad and remittances came back, but the academics weren't talking about it. And the IMF came when we produced, in 2001, a small book called The New Lawares. We thought, we'll call these remittances, people going, there used to be soldiers would go to Lahore, so they were the Lawares. These were the new Lawares. So we produced a report, we had a meeting about this sort of size, and people didn't believe us. So it's not true, this isn't happening at this sort of scale. We were saying really a lot of money is coming in. Anyway, over the years, gradually, people began to realise that remittances really were where it was. So you didn't really have just an agrarian economy, you had what we called a remittance economy. And now, the reliance on remittances in the economy is enormous. I think it was I just took some notes, 2019, just before COVID, $8.24 billion coming in. This is official figures, and believe me, the real figures are much bigger. And then in 2020, 8.1, much the same, COVID. 2021, 8.23, same sort of level of remittances. 2022, 9.3. 2023, 10.79. So through COVID and after, it's actually increased. I don't know what the latest figures are, but it's a substantial amount. And Nepal now relies very heavily on remittances from abroad. So from the agrarian economy, we've moved to what I would call a remittance economy, and that continues. But I jump ahead of myself talking about the 2020s because a number of other important things occurred, and I'm just highlighting one or two of these. 1990 was very exciting for those of us who were outside because it marked the end of the Panchayat period, that whole period of political rule by the monarchy with the so-called panchayat democracy. Enormous excitement. I know there are people here in the crowd now who remember the excitement of all the new NGOs that sprung up, all the different groupings and so on and so forth. And this was the beginning of something that I'll just signal now as an issue to talk about. I don't want to go too much further. But the new dispensation of what people in Nepal were calling democracy, which I would call a multi-party system. Okay, just rest that there, because it was problematic. Did give rise to huge growth in civil society organisations, including particularly people who identified themselves as Janajati, as Adivasi, as different from the previous structure. So it was an exciting and dynamic time, and I wrote various things about coming of democracy and how wonderful this would be. By the time I got to 1995-96, it seemed fairly clear that this wasn't leading to the kind of changes that people had hoped for, and a certain group of people had decided, the Maoists among others, that this really was going nowhere, and they initiated as you know, People's War 1996. At the same time we were looking at the remittance economy, there's a revolution perhaps on its way, a People's War. Very dramatic indeed. So those were exciting times. What happened then, and again, we know sort of complicated series of things, I only try and highlight some points. By 2001, the importance of this People's War was becoming more and more apparent, even to aid agencies and development agencies, and even the government, and people who hadn't really taken much notice of it until then. 2001, of course, was a very dramatic year on the world scale. You know, the attack at the heart of America, the Twin Towers, revolutionaries, terrorists actually, very difficult to tell who were terrorists, who were revolutionaries, actually began, I think, a new era, which was the kind of the beginning of a sort of attack on America's legitimacy, its understanding itself. It had huge implications, led to a series of wars and interventions, as you know, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Libya, all of these fiascos, disasters in my view. So it was a very exciting time in the early 2001, but there was, I think, an attempt at that time to try and reconcile the revolutionary movement with the existing government. It failed, and the struggle, the conflict intensified 2002 to 2005, when King Gyanendra took power, this sort of monarchy took a coup. And then suddenly the international community said, no, we're not having that, that's not. And there was a negotiation, and we can talk about that, where the Maoists came back into the mainstream, seven-party alliance, etc., etc. Now, for me, that could have been an incredible turning point for Nepal. Landslide victory in the elections for the Maoists. They had all the sort of support, I think, from wide across the country. International community was sort of standing back to see what happened. They were delighted that they were no longer terrorists or revolutionaries, but apparently willing to join in the political process. And 2005, Gyanendra was gradually moved aside, so that by 2008, you moved to a republic. Now, these were years where enormous possibilities arose. One thing I draw attention to, I haven't talked about reasons, is the Madhesi uprising and violence and problems in the Terai, where a whole massive group of people said, we don't seem to be part of this. You know, it's all happening in Kathmandu. The old tradition of Kathmandu as the centre and the rest as the periphery within Nepal was coming true, and there was a big resistance. And I noticed last week, Tula Shah, who's a very good friend of mine, used to be director of Nepal, who's a sort of Madhesi supporter, said, it's still not good enough. We're still not part of mainstream politics. So there are regional issues, I think, that need to be thought through, and I won't go into all that in detail. But if I come back again, I think I'm probably moving towards the end, and just think about a number of things that have happened before we come to the present. Just to signal, say 2015, again another significant moment, agreed on a constitution. Okay, from 2008, when it declared a republic, a federal republic, by 2015, it has taken nearly that sort of period of time to actually develop a federal constitution and then work out what federalism meant. And I argued at the time it was a complete mistake. I always thought federalism would be a disaster because it was not particularly democratic. It was presented as democratic. Many of you will disagree with this, but it seems to me we're just another layer of bureaucracy and politicians and so on in 7 new provinces. I suspect that's more or less where we are now. I'm not sure how successful federalism has been, but at that time it was important, and 2015 consolidated that in the constitution. It's taken another 10 years, and I'm trying to think of what you would call this period for Nepal as a whole. Agrarian economy, remittance economy, stagnation, it seems to me, in political terms. In economic terms, I was very struck by a report that Oxfam produced last year, which looked at global inequality, and it drew attention to the fact that there was a massive accumulation of capital, which was not being reinvested in production, either in agriculture or in industry. And I looked at the figures and I saw that last year industrial production in Nepal declined in terms of percentages. Agriculture remains relatively stagnant. So there's very little production going on. Where's all the money? What's happened? Now it seems to me that there is accumulation on an enormous scale. And at a very personal level, I've gone around a lot of parts of Kathmandu in the last 3 weeks, and there's enormous construction. There are hotels everywhere, new houses, new building. There's a lot of activity. There are hotels. There's a lot of money. People not just going to Tama on an outing, but a lot of restaurants. There's money around. Okay, this is the capital. But Oxfam's report said that we're now moving, and it's not just Nepal, of course, because they did look at Nepal. They were looking at it globally. We're coming to a period of takers, not makers. I think it's kind of a nice phrase, you know. So there are people who are taking, accumulating capital, accumulating wealth, and yet it's not going into production. So my question as we end is, where is it going? Well, of course, I'm afraid I do know, but I'm very hesitant to say. But I've noticed that, again, trying to read the Kathmandu Post, and by the way, getting hold of a newspaper these days is really difficult. Everyone's on social media. No one's using... I used Patao last night, or the night before last, to get home from a friend's dinner. You just call someone up. The social media are taking over. But I managed to get hold of and get a delivery to my sport hotel of the Kathmandu Post, and I saw at least 2 occasions, very big issues about corruption. There was an editorial in one last week, I think, about corruption. I noticed that Nepal is now in the grey zone as far as sort of recognition of sort of corruption issues. And without going into detail, I think that there is a serious question of what's actually happening in the Nepali economy. And my suspicion is that there is accumulation of wealth. And my question to all of you, who may well have answers, is where is that going? And if that's not great, is there anything that can be done about that to sort of redirect that or move it back somehow into production? And very brief comments right at the end is there are areas for production. Someone's talked about it the other evening, which is the obvious things that have always been there as possible within the agrarian economy: lightweight, high value, low bulk goods, jaributi, herbs, coffee, tea, herbs and spices, and ginger and turmeric. And there's a massive things that hill economies and mountain economies can produce, and then can be produced, have been historically. There's no technical issues, I don't think. There may be, but that's not happening on any great scale. There are obviously enterprises producing massive chicken, lots and lots of chickens and lots of milk. There is capitalist development in agriculture, but there are lots of things it could go into, and it doesn't seem to be doing to on any scale. Industrial production seems to be collapsing. Even the small industries that were set up under the Panchayat period and then more recently, I see very little sign. I don't know the details, but I see very little sign of that. So there are possibilities for a different kind of economy. But at the moment it seems stuck in remittances, which still continue. And almost everybody I talk to under the age of 30 is either trying to go abroad or has a brother or sister who's abroad and so on. So where are you going to go now? I don't know. Thank you.
Okay, David, this is precisely what I wanted when we shanghaied you into coming here and giving this talk, is where do you go? And your last comments, your comments were very interesting. Let me just recapitulate so that you have, questions. I'm sure you're formulating your own. I'll get to questions. But it's takers, not makers. There's an enormous amount of accumulation going on, but where is it going? We are importing garlic and coriander. And today's newspaper in Nepali, I think it's the Nagarik or Naya Patrika, said we are importing 2 kharab. Now, what kharab is what? 11 zeros? One's scared talking about this, of agriculture produce. Yeah, 2 kharab. That's huge, okay? And corruption. I mean, you cannot open a newspaper today and not see, one new corruption or the other. It's almost like we have a government that's a corruption factory, producing new brands almost every day. And some of the highest people of the land are embroiled in it. And the administration is forbidden from, taking the matter forward or investigating. It's a very, this thing. Industry is collapsing. The other point was, that you on remittance. It's, I understand, 30% of the GDP now. And it is said in the kind of political economy that I study, whenever one sector of the economy grows more than 10 to 12% overall, you end up with what's called a Dutch disease impact. It's a horrible thing. It happened to Nigeria, it happened to Kerala, it happened to Uttarakhand, and it leads to overall deindustrialization, valuing of exchange rates, there's a whole lot of this. It's a Dutch disease thing, very difficult to get out of. It's also going to lead to a massive amount of instability, God forbid, if this Trump tandav goes as it probably will, and lead to a kind of massive global recession. What will happen to these millions of workers who've gone abroad to find jobs, who will definitely be laid off? Are we prepared to handle that? Where is the production here? Now, 2005, 2006, you said could have, and even 2015 could have been a turning point. But something seems to have gone wrong. And what has happened is, it seems we have produced, and this is the question, when you ended, we seem to have produced a new political class. Not just a political class, actually an economic class. In the dying days of the Soviet Union, I still remember, Kunda is here, Eastern Europe, you were there, we saw this, what the common word is not used too much right now, called the nomenclatura, the communist aristocracy, okay, which really ripped the country. And I lived in the Soviet Union, studying there during the Brezhnevite period of stagnation, which Gorbachev called zastoy, stagnation. And it was obvious there were shops specially for Communist Party members where things were available, where common people couldn't buy these things. So we seem to have created a political class that's investing in land and these new constructions and new hotels. We have also, and I'm just close before I go to the floor, when you mentioned that something seems to have happened to the mindset in Nepal, which has moved away from production to some kind of, difficult to put a term to it, you said, we don't know what to call these last 10, 15 years, what is it, remittance economy, okay, now what kind of an economy? I remember Helena Norberg Hodge, who did a lot of work in Ladakh. She gave a residence lecture at Berkeley, and this is a story she told, which I think is very applicable here today for us to reflect on, especially as I mentioned right in the beginning, for the young researchers among all of you who have to find the answers. It's your future at stake right now, more than people like me. But Helena mentioned that when she first came to work in Ladakh, she had a research assistant, and one day she said, take me to the poorest house in Ladakh. So this guy took her to a house, and Helena was confused. I mean, it was as good a house as anybody else's, in fact, slightly bigger. Everything was nice. She didn't notice anything poor about that house. And later it turned out that there was no word for poor in the Ladakhi language. And so when she asked her research assistant, take me to the poorest house, he understood it as take me to the house of the least respected guy in the village. The village idiot, so to speak. Now, apparently he was the son of a headman, but he was kind of really stupid or silly, you know. So that's what it was. 20 years later, she met this guy when she came to Ladakh for another study. And 20 years later, this guy had become a tourism operator, and he saw Helena right at the bus stop at wherever it is, at Himachal at the bottom or wherever it is they go. And he said, "Oh, Helena, so glad you are here. You're the only friend we Ladakhis have. We Ladakhis are poor." So in 20 years, someone who didn't know what the meaning of poverty and poor was, now genetically, Janmajat considered themselves poor. Now there's something in the social mindset that, that really needs understanding as, we struggle now to figure out, where we are headed, what are the dangers facing us, where our political system fails to inspire and so on, I mean, we could go on with this, but let me take some questions. I'll take 3 questions and come back to you, and then we go back for the next cycle.
So not just questions, if people have things they want to say.
Yeah. So you can, but don't make it too long. I mean, we'll have to organize a special Baha lecture for you if you go too long. I'm rather rude moderator actually, so if you go too long, I'll cut you. Okay, please, yeah. Mike, please tell your name and.
Hi, I'm Ruby. And I've known Dr. Seddon since I was 5 years old, so it was like maybe a bit too close for comfort. But my question was about that very phrase that you use, takers not makers, right? And my question, I'm sort of trying to be very evocative of maybe that lecture, Possibility of Nonviolent Revolution by Marx. So what movement-based or institutional recourse do you imagine or do you visualize to see the wresting, or not quite the appropriation, but the putting of use to that appropriated capital into more productive and empowering means for workers and the general population in developing and least developed economies?
Okay, let's take somebody else. Okay, why don't you start with this one?
Yeah, it's not. It's working.
Yes.
It's not for me to say really, but I think that when we first arrived in the 70s, we didn't see any particular political movement. I mean, this was it was the last part of the Panchayat period, as you said, but it wasn't until 1990 that something emerged. I came back and wrote a book called Nepal, The State of Poverty, somewhat later, in which I did see that there would be growing problems. But the problems that we saw at the time were really very different from political ones. We had no political link, so we really couldn't find anything in that direction. What we saw, the crisis that was coming, was environmental, and the if you like, the increasing demand for labour abroad. Now, there is an environmental crisis facing you now, today, us. But the one we thought in the 70s was the one that mattered isn't the one that mattered. It's a slightly off point, but it's about finding it very difficult to see what political recourse there is. But we were very struck by the fact that population growth seemed to be the big issue at the time, and resources about erosion and degradation of the land. There's a man called Eric Eckholm who wrote a book called Losing Ground, and he referred to Nepal specifically. So everyone was concerned with the environmental issue, and those environmental issues haven't gone away. They're different. They're climate change, their lack of rain, their droughts, floods, and so on. But in the meanwhile, we've had this sort of interesting political movement of various kinds, including, as I say, what I thought was a possible genuine revolution, which certainly cost 17,000 lives or whatever it is, but at the end seemed to have some promise. That promise has been, and I wouldn't put it, I would say betrayed. There was a promise. It's been betrayed, and now part of what we're talking about is the takers, not the makers. I don't know. came here by taxi this afternoon, a very interesting conversation with a young man who said, oh, you've been here a long time, and I said, oh, and you come and go and so on. And I said, what do you think is going to happen? You know, because he said, because I can't go abroad. I'm struggling with the taxi. We're being undermined by Patal and other things. And, we have real problems. All my friends have gone abroad. I have a friend who's in the Gurkhas, but you know. I said, well, he said, well, there is this guy Belen, you know, there's a municipality of Kathmandu, there are independent politicians, I don't know enough about it, but independent politicians who are not aligned with the existing three sort of main parties, who seem to me to have been doing a merry-go-round for the last 10 years. And gosh, I remember their names, Oli and Dioba, and they were there when I was there in the 70s. You know, they had a real heroic background. They'd been in jail. They'd been, you know, for their cause. Baburam Bhattarai and Prachanda. You know, all these people. They just seem to be part of a. I don't know. I don't think you want to blame the politicians because a lot of people in business, very rich people, are not politicians. The very simple answer is I don't know where it would come from. I don't see signs of it. I don't actually at the moment see signs of where the economy goes. But I have that problem in my own country at the moment as well. So it's not just Nepal. We're all up in the air with what's going to happen in the world scale. And it's going to have big implications. As I said right at the beginning, I think the relationship between India and China is going to be important. I mean, clearly both of those countries are hugely important for Nepal. I think it's something like 65% of your foreign trade is with India, and most of that, like over 90%, is imports. So you know, on the economic front, I don't know. On the political front, I don't know. But you know, can we have any suggestions, please?
Yeah. While I haven't yet seen hands, can I ask you to sort of, you know, I'm sure a lot of the older ones here, we get young people coming saying, "Sir, what should I do my PhD or master's research on, or something like that?" Now, if a student like that was like you in the 70s and came, and knowing what you do now, especially on the political economy of Nepal, what's going on, the whole center periphery thing now is acquired a different color and dimension and all. What is the area, where would you ask them to start looking at the problem? What is the problem that should be burning them from belly up? Any suggestions? 25 PhDs waiting.
Yeah, I don't know. It's you know, it's very much a matter of personal decision where you go. You could say, I want to do something to change the world myself, and you do it in a small way yourself, and then research the possibilities for that. You know, I want to grow something, or I want to make something, I want to become, you know, a productive agent because that's what's lacking, and I can do it myself, and maybe inspire others and so on. If you're looking to do a study of where things are moving, I came as one of a team, as I say, and we had very different perspectives between us. I had a PhD in anthropology. I'd done it in Morocco, certainly a totally different country, but I thought that the best thing to do was to hang around. There's a very good American sociologist who studied street corner society. He wrote a book called Street Corner Society. His name was, I think, Wilfred White. And he said, what's your research methodology? He said, I just hang out with guys. And I listen, and I watch. So me, the anthropological approach is at my heart, which is you go along, you listen, you talk to all sorts of people, and you sort of sift it. And that's pre your PhD, because at that time you don't know what. And you might come up like with an idea. I mean, my taxi driver, again today, had a very good idea. He said, gosh, you're very old. I said, yeah, I am actually, surprisingly. But he said, you should become a yogi. You should do what old people do. You should go off and retreats. And, you know. So we all find our PhDs, our destinies in different directions. I don't know where I would look now. As I say, my interest at the moment is in this takers not makers area. Who's making the money? What do we do about it? And what do we do about climate change? I mean, God, I should have mentioned it much, much more. It's on us, it's here, it's big. But it's very difficult to know what you do as an individual about climate change. For some people it's flooding, for some people it's landslides, for other people it's no water, for other people it's You know, where do you act on that? I don't know. It's very difficult to find. There's a whole group of people in Britain at the moment who are very radical. I'm part of this, called Extinction Rebellion. We talk about politics. Extinction Rebellion believes in non-violent demonstrations and so on. And I'm part of that group. But 25 of the members of this group are now in jail. And the leader of one of the groups, who was involved in organising a meeting where people sat with placards saying, you know, there's a climate issue, he's in jail for 5 years. 5 years for a peaceful, non-violent protest. Well, that's where I'd go, but I don't want to go to jail.
Yes, 3 questions right here. Okay, one up, right at the beginning. Yeah, right now. Then,
So hi, my name is Agat. I'm fairly new to Nepal, but I'm a political economist, and I'm really interested in topics of degrowth and post-growth. So I was told that Nepal was a really good probably case study for post-growth. But as you said, I don't really quite see any clear direction happening in terms of the economy in Nepal. I'm new, so I'm probably missing a lot of things.
That's great when we were.
But yeah, I see a lot of interesting ideas floated around about Nepal becoming a safe haven for money, becoming Switzerland, or doing IT services. But do you think any of these ideas realistic? And also, yeah, what happens like with India and China? Are they models that Nepal can really consider for growth, for development? I don't see a lot of. We were talking about industries, and I don't see Nepal competing with any of these countries. So, what is the niche? I mean, from a market perspective, what is the niche that Nepal can find and compete? If competing is still what we're trying to do.
My name is Keshav Paudel. I'm editor of Spotlight magazine. My question goes to as you mentioned, 1970s when the economy, rural and urban economy mostly aggregated. Then comes to the 1990 political change and migration and remittance, basically remittance. Now, despite all the possibility to have to make agriculture sector still, if we invest more money, then it can be productive and it can change our society and social economy. What do you suggest? We have the money, as you said, we have the taker, no maker. Farmers once loan, but they could not get because there are so many hurdles in banking system, 13% interest, like that. So suggest us, the agriculture is still a sector that has low investment. So how could we can change that pattern?
Yes, sir. I am a retired police officer because when you talk about this thing, I still remember hippie era. I was roaming around when I was a student at that time, 70s. So since 1976, I have been watching all these political changes and so many systems, so many prime ministers, I saluted them many and I arrested them also many times. But I want to know that, so the changes in political security system in Nepal since, I think a lot of things, and now at the present moment, the whole political government wants to make our police security, internal security, little bit draconian. They want to have a lot of control. I was trained in Germany and I knew the German police. I worked there for 1 year. I was trained by the Bundeskriminalamt. So I think security is a very crucial, like environment or other social, economic also. So you have seen, you have been through all this, you have watched. So could you tell me about the changes and maybe from security point of view, how do you see tomorrow's crisis and challenges? Thank you, sir.
okay, you take these 3 questions, but just to add to what Raviji has just said, today's newspaper says that the Nepal army has begun a complete rethink and revamping of what Nepal's security concern is. I don't know where they're going with it, but it's an extremely important thing.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, as you were saying, it's not clear where productive economy can be developed, but I made some suggestions which are not new, which is about high value, low bulk goods in agriculture, and there's a lot of mileage. And I have a very good friend who was part of our team originally in Pokhara, Indra Gurchan, in whose house I lived, and he was a constructor at the time. He's an entrepreneur basically, and then he moved into coffee production, and he developed a coffee chain with Japan. He basically produced and exported to Japan, specialised. And apparently, I haven't seen him now, I didn't go to Pokhara this time, he's moved on to fish farming. And he's he's not selling the fish to eat, he's selling the fish as fingerlings or whatever we call little tiny fish to other people who are going to make fish farms. So there are many opportunities in my view. I think water, to defer obviously to Deepak here as a water man, but there is scope for saving water, for preserving ponds, lakes. You're going to have all sorts of problems of droughts. So fishing, in the Terai, traditionally, a lot of fish ponds, and that's a very good nutritional. So I think in agriculture, in theory, there are lots of possibilities. I don't quite understand always why they haven't developed. My suspicion is two things. One, developing production is not the problem, it's more the chain, the supply chain, and marketing and so on. And all the flow of goods is from south to north in Nepal, right? And getting a really good chain of sort of circulation. And then the second, of course, is that the nearest obvious market is India. And India they produce all these things, and they have hill areas, and they can produce just the same things, and probably on scale. You can use airplanes, obviously, the light things can be transported. Niche markets, organic, basmati rice produced in the Himalayas, they've got a fantastic, I would have thought brand, brand name, brand recognition. Hasn't been done, I don't understand it. When I first came to Nepal, handmade paper was a really big thing. It's disappearing because people don't use paper in the same way. So there are lots and lots of high value, low bulk goods which in theory could work, but someone needs to work on the supply chains and so on. I think security is very important. I mean, security can be looked at as being security where we are protected, and it can be international and it can be local. And I've been talking with a couple of friends of mine who said, actually it's much more dangerous going out than it used to be, and the police, you bribe them, and so the breakdown of security, I don't know enough about it, but it seems from what I hear that that's an issue within the country. I don't know how much that's true, but I think security is always important. I mean, everyone says the first duty of the government or the state is to protect its citizens. But it doesn't seem to me that Nepal is under threat militarily. I don't see it as King Birendra saw a future of Nepal as a zone of peace, where India and Pakistan could play cricket together. Well, they do anyway, but they could come together. So that's an opportunity. The Himalayas still are there, although I think Machu Picchu is losing it's lost all its snow, and the retreat of snow line in Everest is apparently 150 meters. So even the Himalayas won't last forever as an attraction. But security is important. I don't know enough about how that will be developed, but it's true if the army's thinking of that worries me. Not the same as the police. I have no answers. I'm sure other people will have things to say about that.
Yes.
My name is Mohan Lohani. I represent the academic field. You referred to 2005 when King Gyanendra took power. In 2008, there was a big change. Monarchy was abolished, and the country was declared a republic. But the one interesting thing is that there was a smooth transfer of power, but the king, like King Jahir Shah of Afghanistan, he fled the country and he spent 31 years in Italy. But the king is still here, King Gyanendra.
Yes.
He has not left the country. And only a few days ago, on the eve of 74th our National Day, Democracy Day. He issued a statement and he urged the people to help him to join him in bringing about, in changing all the rubbish that is going on, anarchy, chaos, etc. It's going on. So this has created a sensation. Only yesterday, some members of parliament, really they have reacted very almost vigorously, violently, And one seasoned politician, his name is Bamdev Gautam, he even told the former king to join, to set up a political party and fight election, and if elected, become a prime minister also. So other MPs also, they have also reacted. Now my question to you, of course the king makes statements from time to time, sometimes very provocative also, but do you think there is possibility of monarchy being restored in this country?
I think it's a very good point. I noticed this, that to choose to do that on Democracy Day, is a very good political strategy. The king remains there, as you say, he's in place as an individual, everyone knows he's there, he's made his views very clear. I think, of course, there is a possibility, and many people in Nepal, I suspect, would say, well, in the old days, under Mahendra and Birendra, we had, a degree of security, peace, there's less corruption. So many people would look back to that period and say, we can recreate that again. Now, I'm not sure that that could be recreated again, but it's certainly not impossible, I would have thought, and there are many people sitting not a million miles away from me who would say that is a possibility and would hope for it. And that's something that's entirely within the scope of other politicians and other people to decide whether they wish to support that move or not. You are a republic, but it's taken a long time to create that. That doesn't mean that can't be reversed. It's obviously a possibility that many Nepalis might welcome.
There are two questions here. Spain and Cambodia that come to mind, but I'll leave that aside. Let's leave that a million miles away.
Thanks, thank you for the very, very nice and very light presentation.
Your name, please.
My name is Dilli Paudel. I'm affiliated with Southeast Institute of Advanced Studies. I'm in Missouri by training. There I do research on forest, urban, and disaster. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
My question is very curious. I say it's not a question. You said that when you back second time Nepal around 95, 96, you observe not much changes. It's like stagnated, if I understood correctly.
Yes.
Well, what do you think? What were the mistake that the then government or policymaker did, which caused that stagnation in last 20 years after the first visit? Some mistakes, some wrong decisions at some point, so that didn't allow Nepal change, not stagnated. Do you have any kind of kind of analysis or whatever, your opinion on this, by the way?
Thank you very much for your presentation. It's really, really useful for us as being a student of sociology. And you mentioned a lot of things about production, market, this type of things, yeah. And you visited in 1974. What I remember that at that time, there was no television, no mobile phone, no liberalization policy, because liberalization policy just happened in 1984 from Prakash Chandra Lohari. So now this time there is big effect of globalizations, and everywhere there is market, not production from the Nepalese people, but from outside, either India or China. We can get everything in our village, clothes, shoes, everything. And microbus, buses, taxis, everything is here. So the lifestyle is very much changed from 1974 to right now. So, but we are thinking agricultural pattern, not new way. At that time, the agricultural system looks like self-sufficient agricultural system, interconnecting. We do still have the Parma Pratha or a lot of things like that.
Yeah.
But now the international market, liberalization, everything is broken. What I remember like that. And so in this crucial thing to get more production, do you think we need to change agricultural policy or rethink about liberalization or re-evaluate the impact of liberalization or minimal government, like you repeatedly said, Trump administrations, we are trained laissez-faire economy. Now in US, what type of economy that? Laissez-faire or strong government or minimal government? So not only in Nepali context, we have to think about Nepal context and linking with the global context also. So in these crucial situations to develop Nepal, what do you suggest for us?
I'll come back.
Two together. Well, they're both asking issues I can't answer for you, really. I think that the problem that we saw in both the 70s and the 90s was that the state was not an enabling state in terms of providing the kind of support that people needed at the grassroots. So we ask questions like, when did you last see a technical forester or an agricultural advisor or what have you? I think the state just did not have, and I think it still does not have, the capacity to promote and engage with agriculture, and leave aside other sectors, in the way that it should do. And we have similar problems in Britain, where farmers are up in arms about the government at the moment, and real problems about agriculture, and it may collapse entirely. So I think it's the lack of state intervention in the productive sectors. Because I think in many countries it's the relationship between the state and private enterprise that has produced certain sorts of dynamics. It's not the liberal vision of just the market, and it's not the sort of central socialist idea of just the state. But that sort of dynamic, a cooperation, is required. But for that, the government administration, the apparatus of the Department of Forestry, Department or whatever it is, has to be engaged. They have to be out there. So, to promote these new technologies and new crops and what have you, it will require support. And, farmers look for that. But I don't think that's there. Now, how you change that, I don't know. I think the state has been more patrolling, regulating than it has been enabling for a long time. I think with regard to the fact that you now become, as I am in my country, largely consumers of products produced elsewhere, that's the way the world is. That's how it is. You can't all be self-sufficient. And there's a difference between being food secure, shall we say, and food self-sufficient. I mean, Nepal could never produce enough for all its people in all areas, but it was more or less self-sufficient in agricultural produce, basic agricultural produce, up until not so long ago, in the 90s. So I think finding the balance between self-reliance and sovereignty, that is control within your borders, not just security, but controlling and intervening and trying to make the most of things, but also recognising we live in a global economy where what happens, not just in America, but in Beijing and so on, where they sneeze, we catch a cold. And that's unavoidable now, I think. There's no going back. But there are sectors, I mean, IT is one. I mean, I talk to a lot of young people whenever I can, if they have the time. They're too busy on their phones usually, but, when you talk to people, a lot of them are in IT, technology. There are also possibilities. And a lot of young people who are studying abroad are studying, all sorts of things, from IT to architecture, all sorts of things. So there are possibilities. How much of that can be brought back and used here, I don't know. That will depend on somehow bringing all these young people back or working abroad, because their lives are moving on. They're not just going as 20 or 30-year-olds, they'll come back as 40-year-olds. So how to bring their knowledge and experience and expertise back and use it, is something you guys have to sort out.
Yeah, we have question in the back, we have former secretary and election boss.
Thank you, sir, for your wonderful presentation. Many of us were waiting, lying there. There was such a big crowd, and we all are there, just standing up and to hear you speak, and that's a wonderful opportunity for us. I'm Kripendra Amartya, and I would like to ask you about the system of government. Currently, we have three types of government: the local government, the state government, provincial government, and the federal government. In Rashtriya Panchayat, we used to have the Gram Panchayat, then there was Zilla Panchayat, then there was Ansar Panchayat, and then there's Rashtriya Panchayat. And so they were multi-tier government. And then even in the era, like in 1990 onwards, we still had those kind of structures. And whenever I think about what the zones do, is about the number plates. And beyond that, I don't even think about it. So what was the purpose? Because I was very young back then, in 1990s, and you have seen the world. What was there that there was less hierarchy, or there were more hierarchies, or there were more structures? So can you give me a better insight to this? Thank you, sir.
Sanjeev, please. What's about me? No question? Okay. Yeah, somebody else, please, more questions. Just take. Yes, already.
I have a very short question that you have discussed from 1974 to till today about Nepal. And did you see changes happening in Nepal, or did you see transformation taking in Nepal? Both words are entirely different, what I think. So can you contextualize it on political, social, and economic aspects?
No, I think we can play with words in English. I said in French, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The more it changes, the more it's the same. That's true in all societies. There are many things that are continuing. And some of it relates to the political structures that you ask about. I mean, there are elements of that. You do have a degree of decentralization. Some people thought this would be a good thing to have 7 provinces. Personally, as I said before, I think it was a mistake. But transformation, I don't know, is it a matter of degree or kind? You're suggesting they're different, that change is different from transformation. I mean, it is transformed, yes, in many, many ways. But and I have to say that if you look at objective statistics about life expectancy and demography and so on, Nepalis live longer, live healthier, live better. They have more money, they have more television. So actually that is a very positive change. I don't want to deny that. We're looking for better things than we have, but it's improved enormously. Life expectancy when in the 70s was much, much lower. I mean, you do face another problem, which is more and more old people. You will have a problem in 20 years as the structure of ages changes. But I don't know, you tell me whether it's changed or transformed in your lifetime. We'll come back to you. But in terms of the hierarchies, I'm not sure. They perform very different functions, I think, under the Panchayat system. I mean, the Zilla Panchayat was pretty minimalistic. I remember going to visit them. They had a very small office. And I'm not sure what I did, but it was more of a structure down to administer and there was less politicking. So I think they actually perform different functions. It's not just that there are more or different levels. Whereas now, I mean, the functions that a provincial state apparatus takes on is very substantial, which means you're employing a lot of bureaucrats. There's a big building, so there's a lot of money going into running a province. So I think they're very different. I don't think you can just compare them directly. The total system is different. Whether it's delivering for people better, that's for other people to say. I just don't know. I don't know.
Great. More questions?
Time is moving on.
Yes. We're coming to a close, but yeah. Let's take one and then I'll have.
Hi, my name is Rafael, and I just wanted to refer to your observation from early 1970s concerned this post-feudal legacy. And do you still see this? And as a sociologist, I'm particularly interested whether you see these relics of feudal society, particularly in social structure of today's Nepali society. Even though we are living, I'm not Nepali, but even though Nepal is a republican regime these days, do you still feel that this feudal legacy has any comprehensive, substantial impact upon citizenship models, thinking, social organization? Perhaps I'm asking too much, but even if you could give a flavor, fair enough.
Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah. Oh, there's one in the back here, please. Yeah, perfect.
Thank you for your good presentation. I'm Dr. Savitri Thapa Gurung. I think you want to know, answer, who are the takers. And in my small mind, small thinking, I think the takers are politicians, NGO workers, the supporter, the big people who support the politicians and make money. Politicians, they don't want anything rather than taking from the state. They don't want any, they want their interest from what they did in jail years, how many years they spent in jail. They want interest and more interest. And also the bureaucrats, they think they are the one who have contributed this state, and they don't want to spend few penny for state. They just want to take. There are so many things in my mind, but for now, this much. Thank you very much.
Okay, any more? Then we'll take that as the last question. We're coming to the close of our session. You take that, and I have a few questions, and we'll
sure.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, on the last point you make, I mean, I would say this is a general phenomenon. It's not just a problem in Nepal. It's become more and more obvious that in my country, in Britain, there is a great deal of corruption. But I would hesitate to say it's just politicians. I think that's not fair. There are businessmen, there are contractors, there are people who are in private enterprise, many people. And of course they link together. Okay, I mean, often literally, you know, through family ties and so on. There's been some very interesting sociological work done in Britain on the family networks of people at the top, just to call it that. You know, not just politicians, directors of companies, members of the aristocracy, all of these linked together as a sort of nexus of people who are in a very privileged position, and they take advantage of the privilege to gain other privileges. So it's not just, don't just blame the politicians, it's not fair. Maybe partly, but lots of other people who are business and so on. And then I go back to the UK, which is very interesting because unlike you, we actually have a royal family that's working. We have in a sense, I'm not working, that's the wrong word. But it's in existence, and it's very active. And it's not just a royal family. There are dukes and there are earls, and they own huge swathes of London or Norfolk or whatever. We have a semi-feudal structure that is right at the heart of one of the most developed capitalist countries in the world. So these things continue to have a real serious impact. So to your point, yes, I can't speak for Nepal as a whole at the moment, or I will be doing more research on it, but in terms of agrarian structures, there are still landowners who have people who are bonded or linked to them and so on. Politically, of course, there have been legalization of, emancipation of bonded labourers and so on, but many of these people are in very much the same real situation as before, even if their legal status has changed. So I think, particularly in the Terai still, in many areas, there are still large landowners who don't really farm, and they just run it as an estate, as a business. Keeping land is valuable. I talked about movement to the roadsides and growth of towns. Land becomes real estate. So you start being a feudal landowner, then you become a rentier in a town. The names change, the structure changes. Some of the mentality is there. One of the ways you might characterize Nepal is increasingly a rentier state. The people gain money from owning property, from owning this, or being a member of a government or a party. So you actually derive benefit from where your position is or your status. And land is crucial, and of course in Kathmandu, land is particularly valuable. So I would say yes, there are these relics and so on, and in my own country it's hidden, probably more than it is here. But the amount of land that is owned by the Duke of Norfolk particularly, by the Crown, we talk about the monarchy, the Duchy of Cornwall, the Prince of Wales, I mean these are antique titles in a modern state. So we have a hugely, and that does have impact, I think, I really do, on people's mentality. So yes, sociologically things change, they evolve, but the remnants for us are in Britain of a time that is before the bourgeois revolution of 17th century. It goes back 400 years. We still have people in Scotland, for example, that own huge tracts of grouse moors where they bring rich people to shoot grouse. And they benefit from this huge land and it's entitled. So yes, it continues.
Okay, so we're coming to the close. I'll just flag some questions that your talk provoked in my mind. Not that there are easy answers, but you can respond to them. But to leave it for the younger lot of researchers emerging, I think it's a very exciting time we're in Nepal if you're a researcher. I wish I was 40 years younger. There's lots of research to do. But a couple of things I want to just flag from what you've said. It's interesting. I'm arguing that the word development should be deconstructed into subikas and kubikas. Good development and bad development. Development by itself is not good. We've seen Melamchi, we've seen lots of things. It can't be called good development. Yes, there were rentiers who made massive amounts of money in these projects, airports that don't fly any planes, but the people who built it made tons of money. So you have a class that has emerged, which is basically into construction. Okay? Now, what struck me long ago when I converted from being an engineer into a social scientist was suspension bridges. The Swiss were heavily into. And what struck me even at that point was, yeah, suspension bridges are much, it's a nice thing to have, you can't be against it, it's so much convenient. But I noticed that what it did was it threw the most marginalized community in Nepal, Bote community, out of business. Because in their dugout canoes, they would take people across for a small amount of money, but once the suspension bridge came, they were out. Now, point is, suspension bridge, yeah, it's a good development, but if you look at it from the other side, it was brought in by usurping the livelihood of somebody else and not providing an alternative. So can you say that's a good development? Is it a subikas or a kubikas? For a Bote community, of course, it was a disaster, not just a kubikas. Okay? That's one example. There are tons of examples with marginal communities that you find where you have tourism development that really doesn't benefit the people around. The other is a recent work that we are doing. surveying energy use across Nepal. It's quite unique. You can go to our website, you'll find the one on household survey is already out. And we are in the middle of a energy industry survey of actual energy use in Nepal. Fascinating kind of results. But there was one data, now quantitative survey nationwide, they give you the what answer, they don't tell you why. And to find why is the more interesting thing, as you said, and that's my job, which is to go and talk to people, guff, And one question was, well, we are one of the lowest electricity consuming countries per capita in the world. We are just a little bit ahead of Afghanistan. Bangladesh is 2 times higher than us, 2 times. We are 300, they are 600 units of electricity per capita per annum. India is 4 times. Bhutan is God knows how much, 5,500, you calculate, okay? Now, in such a situation, we are talking about not increasing electricity use within Nepal, but exporting to Bangladesh and India. And this is what the government does. Okay. Now, this is quite silly, if you ask me. So, one of our questions in the survey was that to find out how do you increase the per capita electricity consumption in Nepal to at least come up to Bangladesh level, which is 2 times, and that's huge. So we said, question, if you had cheap and reliable electricity, what would you invest in? So except for a few who said they would buy irrigation pumps, stunning result was 49% of the people nationwide said, I will not invest in anything. Now the problem here is, for me, a political economic problem. It goes against all laws of economics as we have studied. If things are cheaper and more reliable, more people will buy it, right? Okay. Here, half the Nepalis are saying, no, I will not. So what the hell was going on? So we spent time walking around in the villages, and I'll just give you 2 instances, and they'll probably tell a lot of things. Out in the Tarai, Nawalparachi, a young guy, he had worked in Doha in a supermarket, he's back, he says, I'm not going back, my kids will be, if I'm not around and all, I'll work here. He says, I worked in a supermarket. I thought I'm in a village, but I have a good road in front of me. So I'll open a small mini market, a supermarket. And I know how to do that. I can, that'd be good. And I have space here to do that. His answer was, Moile Sakina, sir, I couldn't do it. Another example, I'll tell you why. A lady who has some cattle and things like that wanted to expand her dairy to actually do curd and chena, vyapar, expand things, and she could do it. She said, Moile Sakina, sir, I couldn't do it. Now, why they couldn't do it was very interesting, They have the capability, they have the expertise, it's their own area, there's a need for it, okay? This thing about takers and makers, okay? The answer was, well, you have to build something like that, you got to take a loan from the bank. To take a loan from the bank, you must have registered something somewhere. Even at the ward level, there is so much corruption. They ask for so much bribe even to register a small village kind of a dairy or a supermarket, that party khalena, sir, it's just not profitable. And what was even more shocking was when they said that it's no longer hidden. Before it was under the table, now it's over the table. They bluntly say, at the ward level I'm talking, not the national level, says, to get this job, we had to pay. Our bosses, our political bosses, our bureaucratic bosses, and so we have to recoup our costs. So this is another example. So my question to you is, we talked about it on Twitter, we are together in all kinds of things. This red-green alternative issue, Michael Redcliffe kind of stuff, okay? Now, there is a need, when there is so much poverty, there is so much, lack of justice or whatever you call it, that, the idea of social justice will not go away in political thing. Despite the fact that our parties that call themselves Marxist, Leninist, Maoist, Democratic Socialist have given up on all those things and gone crony capitalist, this kind of politics in Nepal will emerge from the new Balin Shahs, as your taxi driver was telling you, in the future. Now, I end by asking this climate change question. Trump has moved out of Paris second time, and this time he's moving with a vengeance, as you can see. So there's little chance that COP will have any effect in the future at all now. It already didn't. COP29 was a total failure, as you know. Okay. Now, point is, in Gorkha, when I was there, a farmer who grew potatoes and put it in his doko and carried to Gorkha Bazaar to sell, walking 1 hour, could not sell his potatoes in Gorkha Bazaar. Why? Because potatoes coming all the way from Punjab, burning 2,000 kilometers of diesel, he could not compete with. Now, there are things happening in India and all, but why is our political system that we are ruled by communists, let's not forget, and socialists, jointly. Okay. Why is it that our system that professes to be communist, Leninist, Marxist, socialist is totally insensitive to this? And so I did a little bit of investigation and I found out that it is because rentier system, it is because imported vegetables provide the government revenue at Birganj and Bhairava. A farmer carrying potatoes and trying to sell in the market does not provide them the rajaswa. And I'm reminded of my colleague whom we worked with, he's not very well now, Dr. Devendraj Pandey. We worked together setting up this Rural Self-Reliance Development Center. When he once remarked, and I've said this many times, sort of almost off the remark, he said, there is no finance ministry in Nepal. I laughed. I said, you are a finance secretary, you are a finance minister, damn it. And you say there's no finance ministry, what the hell do you mean? He said, yeah, we don't have a finance ministry. If we did, the finance ministry will be worried about that this kind of taxation, this kind of policy will give agriculture growth, this will give industrial growth. There is no thinking whatsoever there. The only thinking is where can we get more rajaswa revenue? And what is that revenue used for? It is used for our new nomenclatura, the new political class. When the province is completely financed by now World Bank loans and things like that, and Trump has just cancelled it, as you heard it on YouTube, saying it's ridiculous. Okay, so it's a rentier class, and the revenue goes to the rentier class. So, as a political economic sort of question, what is this new class we have? Milovan Djilas, Yugoslavia, he wrote that classic book, the new class or whatever. So we've given, it seems, a birth to a new political class that is rent extractive, has absolutely no intention to invest the country's future in any production, that we are importing coriander and garlic from China now, instead of growing. I grew it in my roof, terrace. So we have ended up with this, if potatoes that burn 2,000 kilometers of diesel are cheaper and a Nepali farmer growing organic potatoes, carrying it on his muscle back, cannot compete with, then what will happen to climate change? And what will happen to Nepal as climate change is going to make things much, much worse. So these are the questions that came to my mind as I listened to you, and I'm sure there's no easy answer, but still, why don't you close with some remarks on this, and then we'll close.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for everyone for bearing with us. There are always winners and losers in process of change. And I remember I used to live in Norfolk, which is in the east of England, which is well known as an area where weavers, people who made wool, were very successful. And there are a lot of churches in Norfolk, which were the ways in which the weavers paid back, thank God. When Lancashire started cotton mills, all the weavers, their industry was destroyed. There's no one there to save them. So there are always going to be winners and losers in that sort of change. All that can be done, and it can be done, is that some entity, which is usually has to be the state, intervenes to ensure that there is a social justice in transition. Now that can be done. The Japanese moved very strongly away from coal use and manufacturing a long time ago because they had a very detailed 10-year plan to actually provide support for the miners in coal areas, and they had a very effective transition. In Britain, Mrs. Thatcher took on the miners and brought out the police, and there was almost civil war, and broke the miners' strikes. And since then we haven't had that sort of collective trade union power. So there are different ways of making a transition. And Britain is now pretty much out of coal, but there are ex-mining communities all over the north of Britain where people are living on benefits, because that was never really a transition. So it can be managed, but it takes a lot of intervention, and to come to your real point, it takes the commitment, the will, the political will, of the state apparatus. It has to be geared to providing that sort of support and transition. And of course it does repay itself. It's not just a cost. I mean, investments actually do produce returns. An investment in trying to respond effectively to climate change is much, that sort of level of investment is much less than just sitting back and waiting. Because believe me, no one in the world yet really understands that how serious, it's not climate change, it's a crisis, it's huge, and it's happening now. And I don't know what will happen in Nepal, but there will be that sort of change. How you change, if you like, the social conditions so that there is a coordinated state and private response, and it needs both, I don't know. I mean, you have NAPA, you have a National Action Plan, you have disaster planning, you have local action plans. There's a ton of paper about what to do in a disaster. When a disaster comes like 2015, it's local people who begin to help immediately, some NGOs, eventually the state becomes involved and so on, but it's a cumbersome process. And responding to disasters is happening all the time. I think I've said, I read the Kathmandu Post now, it's only source. 3 articles from the field, one of them today I think from Rukum, about what is actually happening in villages where water is becoming scarce. Firstly, it starts by having to go further to collect water and wood and so on, and then you can't get it, so you move. So whole families relocate, whole villages relocate. Migration becomes a massive, that will happen. It has to happen. You know, individuals can't deal with this. So, yeah, I think it's probably true that you're living with like we are in Britain, increasingly a category, I'm not sure if it's a social class in the right, but anyway, a category of people overlapping who are taking huge benefits from their position. Okay, so this is a positional advantage. If I'm in this job, or I'm in this position, or I own land, then I can reap the benefit. It's not productive, it's a rent in a sense. So rentiers is kind of the way people often talk about it. How to change that is extremely difficult. You need to challenge it, and it has to be challenged politically. If you want to do it non-violently, it takes a lot longer, and it has to come from somewhere. I see no movement at the moment, because everyone, as you're pointing out, even at the lowest level, becomes co-opted in this unavoidable situation. So if you want to be a small producer of potatoes, and you can't sell because they're coming in from Punjab, cheaper for these reasons, you don't have the weight, you don't have the power to go and challenge the authorities at the customs in Birgunj or Barrow or wherever it is. It needs a collective action, it needs mobilisation, but where's that coming from? That's over to you people. And I in the meanwhile, try and do my small amount to do this in Britain, where I have a small voice.
Okay, thank you, David, and thank you, all of you. I think it's been provocative. I think we're all going back with ideas about what we can explore further. My last task as a moderator is to give you this social science Baha token of memory, something that you can take.
Very much.
And when you, yes, sure, please. So every time you drink coffee, you think of us.
Thank you for spending so long listening, and all your questions. No answers really. Thank you very much.